So here we are in Module 3. We will be covering chapters 5 and 6 in this module, and those cover the topics of attitudes and then stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So here are the tasks for this module as usual. We'll skip down to the objectives and get into those first. For chapter 5, we're taking a look at people's attitudes. So first and foremost, we want to understand why attitudes even matter to social psychologists. Knowing people's attitudes, what kinds of information does that give us? What can we do with that information? That's sort of the primary importance. And then we can start dissecting how people get their attitudes or how they acquire their attitudes. Number one is through learning. So maybe some of you remember some learning principles back from intro psych, or if you've taken psych of learning, you'll have covered this in detail. But it involves things like operant conditioning, classical conditioning, modeling, and observational learning. So operant conditioning was the Skinner stuff, right, with the pigeons and teaching the pigeons to do different things based on how they were rewarded. Were they rewarded with positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? How often were they rewarded, and so forth? Classical conditioning is the work of Pavlov. You probably remember his salivating dogs and how we start to associate certain responses with the outcome that they produce. And it's through those associations that we learn what things go together. If I do this, then this. And that sort of happens at a subliminal level. We're not necessarily aware that we're being conditioned in that manner. Modeling is simply, modeling after a person. That could be a teacher or a parent or a friend, observing their behavior and then doing like behavior. And then observational learning comes from the work of Bandura in looking at how we watch around us, much like modeling. And we learn through seeing. We learn through watching other people get punished. That's a huge observational learning aspect is, we don't necessarily have to do wrong ourselves, but when others do wrong, we see the consequences. We learn very quickly not to do those things. So we acquire our attitudes in many ways through these types of principles, and a lot of this happens without us knowing it. Okay, we are classically conditioned all the time. We associate brand names with a particular feeling, like this brand is going to make me feel this way, or we have a pleasant experience with something and then we remember that and it's kind of ingrained in our memory, and then we associate it with liking the thing. And so a lot of times our attitudes just form this way. And there's a big work that we're going to discuss later in the chapter of persuasion and how this is used in marketing strategies and advertising and the like to get people to buy. It's the heart of consumerism. Get people to buy products or spend money on subscriptions or memberships because we have certain attitudes towards whatever it is that we're doing, and those attitudes didn't just come out of nowhere. They were embedded in us somehow, some way through a type of learning. We also acquire attitudes through social comparison. We talked about social comparison in the last chapter. Just in looking at what our peers have, we can call that modeling as well. But seeing what our peers have, we want to be on par, and we want to compare favorably to our peers, so we can acquire our attitudes in that way. And we use different types of reference groups. As we're forming these attitudes, we use our friends, or we might use our coworkers. We might have various groups that we look to for different things. Like if I'm forming a political opinion, I might look more to my colleagues or my coworkers than my family, because I know my family doesn't see things the way I see things, and we like to confirm our attitudes. And so we often look to people that will do that. That's a kind of like a confirmation bias that we have. So it can be anything from a political ideology or agenda to religious beliefs to product, purchases and consumerism. When we talk about attitudes, it involves many different things. So once we have sort of the foundation of how attitudes work, we'll then start to look at, well, then what is the link between what we think, our attitude, how we feel, and then our resulting behavior? Like, how do attitudes affect our behavior? Because then that's really what social psychologists are interested in, is if we know someone's attitude, can we predict their behavior? Or if we see their behavior, can we predict what their attitudes might be? And in being able to do that, we can make, solid predictions. We might be able to predict, whether or not somebody might commit a crime, or if somebody's a threat, or predict what they're going to buy, or how much money they're going to spend, or things like that. So we'll look at a lot of different influences on our behavior when we know attitudes. This topic should look familiar, pluralistic ignorance. So it ties it into attitudes and how that operates in our behaviors. So you've already been exposed to this concept, and now it's going to dive a little bit deeper in looking at how it can predict behavior. And then we're going to get into some of the theory here, what past psychologists have proposed as a means of understanding someone's behaviors. Again, theories like the theory of reasoned action and the theory of planned behavior, those actually come very much so out of health psychology, which is an offshoot of social psych. When we look at people's attitudes towards their health and then the resulting behavior. So if I think that smoking's not a big deal, I'm probably going to be behaving in certain ways that fall in line with that attitude. I'm going to smoke more. I may not watch what I eat as much. I may not be as healthy as I can, because our behavior is affected then by that attitude. And so this can sort of predict maybe whether or not somebody will seek help if they're sick, whether or not they'll get care, go to the doctor, things like that, whether or not they'll take an illness seriously or ignore it. And so that can be very useful for healthcare professionals to understand if we want to try to promote healthy behaviors like preventative health, like using a condom or buckling your seatbelt or eating right or exercising. Those are all behaviors we like to have people to have, but before the behavior can happen, we have to influence someone's attitudes because attitudes often predict behavior. So we'll look at then getting into here, like I mentioned, persuasion and how we can persuade others into doing what we want. And there's different ways of doing that, different processing that we're going to take a look at in the chapter, and different aspects of it. This is very much the work of Cialdini. He's really big into persuasion and how people can use it in business. Like I said, marketing, advertising, many, many different fields is very useful for. So this is a good place where psychology cross-sects other disciplines like business, education, criminal justice, in trying to understand the reasons behind behavior, that being one's attitudes. We'll also be looking at cognitive dissonance, which basically means when your attitudes and your behaviors don't match. So you say you believe one thing, or you subscribe to one ideology, but then your behavior doesn't match it. Or you're doing something is wrong, but then you reason it out as to why it's right, even though it's wrong. And again, we can go back to the smoking example. Most people who smoke know it's not good for you. They know the stats. They know it can kill you. I mean, it's on the cigarette packages. However, if you're a smoker and you enjoy smoking for whatever reason, I want to lose weight, or it makes me less stressed. You're going to go ahead and try to minimize then the dangers. You're going to try to convince yourself that it's not so bad. I can quit whenever I want. Oh, it won't really affect me, because it doesn't feel good to know you're doing something that's wrong. We don't like that. We feel hypocritical. I know this is bad, but I'm doing it anyways. It leaves us feeling dissonant, which is where that term comes from. And so we like to try to then either bring the behavior in line with the attitude, or the attitude in line with the behavior. And usually it's attitude in line with behavior, because behaviors are really hard to change. So we kind of don't do that, whereas we can change our attitudes. Well, I'm really addicted to smoking. I can't really quit. So the alternative is to kind of believe in my head that it's not so bad. And so we change the attitude there. So there's some videos actually in Revel as you're reading through the chapter that talk about this concept and give some really great examples of how that operates. And so that kind of concludes the chapter there. We'll get into some other things, just some other studies that deal with cognitive dissonance and such, but good stuff there. So all of this, I should say, attitudes, the chapter on social perception and social cognition are all building blocks for then this chapter that we're going to tackle. And I'm just going to go through this a little bit quicker. This chapter is all about prejudice, racism, and discrimination, understanding where it all comes from, what feeds into it, what types of things are operating in society today that keep prejudice alive and racism alive. Why haven't we gotten rid of it? What are the different types? We have gender discrimination. We have obviously racial discrimination. There's so many different things to be aware of, and it's changed over time. Prejudice today and racism today is not how it looked 50, 60 years ago. Very, very different. So the chapter is going to walk you through sort of what feeds into it, what's the foundation, and then, what is going on in our world today that's continuing to drive it and feed it. Why hasn't it died out? And then it's going to look at some theories as to how we can minimize stereotypes and how we can minimize racism. I don't think the goal is to get rid of it. And if you talk to many experts, you'll hear them very candidly say, I don't know if we'll ever squash racism. We are all different people, and our differences will always exist. And some people can get through those differences and some people can't. But we can learn to minimize it. Okay? We can learn to reduce it down through understanding and education. And so some of the studies here are going to look at that. There's an interesting video that you'll be watching in this module about the implicit association task, the IAT, which kind of shows you that a lot of our prejudice is implicit, meaning we don't even know we're prejudiced. It just kind of happens. We've been so trained in thinking about our differences that today, someone will say, well, I'm not prejudiced. I don't have anything against anybody. But if you really dissect it through a task that's meant to test your quick reactions and your basic reactions, that being reactions you can't really think about, you just have to go on your gut, so to speak, you'll see that we are prejudiced. We all are in some way, shape, or form. And so then what do we do with that? Does that prejudice then affect our behavior? Would we discriminate? And so forth. So we'll be looking at some theory there, and then as well some possible solutions of how to overcome it. So your article readings this week are Articles 17 and 16. Here are your chapter slides, your PowerPoints. And then I've got some extra videos in here this week. Here's that IAT video. These are in addition to the videos in Revel. So you still need to be watching the videos in Revel. But we'll look at prejudice from Jane Elliott's study. We'll look at a quick video on homophobia in the media, how the media perpetuates homophobia. And then you'll kind of have something nice, which is a feature movie, Crash. It's an excellent movie. So many great actors and actresses. And that will dissect prejudice and racism and the components of it. You'll see a lot of the chapter concepts mimicked there. And then finally, your discussion and your exam.